Hello, my name is Dr. Jackalyn Rainosek, and I'm with DTP-Leadership Group, and this is Hot Topic Bold Talk. My podcast is titled Not Martial Law, Why America Must Draw the Line Now. Now, I will tell you, when I wrote this and when I developed it, there are a lot of emotions I feel about it: fear and concern and disappointment and an awareness of what is going on in our country. So what I want to do is I want to go through and take you through what I've written. And so I hope you'll forgive me if I read a great deal of it, because I've really thought about it and I want to share my ideas with you. So that's why I'm going to do that. I want to start with the opening night, the night the helicopters came to people's homes in Chicago. I have never wanted to write about my country in a tone reserved for places that have lost their way. Yet here we are, standing in our own streets, watching helicopters comb Chicago's sky at 1 a.m., listening to the hollow thud of flashbang grenades ricketing down a hallway where a child keeps her shoes beneath the bed. Doors splintering. Families are zip-tied. A woman staggers into the night toward a hospital with bullet wounds, described later as the result of defensive shots. And by dawn, the government congratulates itself for showing strength. Strength? No. This is a federalization of fear, masking as law and order, a political performance that mistakes domination for safety and speculation for justice. We are told that our cities are training grounds and that the president's duty is to assert control, but control of what exactly? Of crime? No. Of protests? We have rights to speak out in America. Of political narratives, or most dangerously, of expectations that the Constitution, not the commander-in-chief's whims, govern public life. So let's name what this really is. It's not normal to deploy military forces or federalized guard units into American cities over the explicit objections of state leaders. It is not constitutional to treat the U.S. military as a domestic police force, except under narrow, extraordinary conditions, which I'll talk about, because I lived during the time that President Johnson used his in Alabama. The fact is, we cannot support these kind of actions by Trump. It is not moral to zip tie children in the dark and pretend that their fear is collateral damage in someone else's war. It is a deliberate push past the line between civilian governance and militarized rule, and we must draw that line again more brilliantly than before and stand on it together. Let's look at what we've normalized. Authoritarianism doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It asks small permissions in a great hurry. It teaches us a new vocabulary: enemy within, war zones, training grounds, until our ears grow numb to the violence required to make these words feel true. When leaders rebrand neighborhoods as battlefields, they're not describing reality. They are manufacturing consent for tactics that would otherwise be unthinkable. The philosopher Anna Arendt warned that the greatest enemy of freedom isn't always a tyrant. Sometimes it's the quiet erosion of judgment in ordinary citizens who step by step learn to accept the unacceptable. That erosion shows up first as language. If you can be persuaded that your neighbors are insurgents, you can then be persuaded that their children's tears are a regrettable necessity. If you can be persuaded that judges who enforce limits are committing legal insurrection, you can be persuaded that the separation of powers is a luxury we cannot afford. And if you can be persuaded that this time is an exception, you can then be persuaded that the exceptions never end. So let me be explicit about the moral stakes we have here. A midnight raid in which families are diptied is not triumph, it is trauma. Helicopters over an elementary school are not policy, they're warnings. Flashbangs in an apartment hallway are not justice, they are the sound of a government confusing force with legitimacy. We are told that the speculation shows conviction. I say it shows panic. Panic that ordinary law enforcement, evidence, and due process cannot make the political case the administration wants to make. It is easy to frighten a city rather than trying to persuade it. So let's look at the constitutional lines. The law always draws the lines we need. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 forbids using Army and by policy the Air Force as domestic police. The National Guard is an exception only when operating under state control or under narrowly defined federal authority. And the Insurrection Act, the favored refuge of the strong men fantasizing about order, permits domestic deployment only when there's an actual insurrection, rebellion, or a breakdown of civil authority. So profound that ordinary law cannot function. That didn't happen in Chicago. It didn't happen in DC. It didn't happen in LA. Those aren't just words in an old statute book. They are hard-won guardrails between a free society and rule by force. When a federal court in Oregon told administration it could not militarize the Oregon National Guard to police protests, the judge did not invent a new doctrine. She enforced the one we already have. This is a nation of constitutional law, not military law. When the White House attempted an end run by sending California Guard to Portland, the court stopped that too. You cannot launder an unlawful purpose by swapping state uniforms. Illinois and Chicago followed with their own lawsuit, calling federalization what it was, a dangerous overreach, untethered to any legitimate emergency, an attempt to use military power to choreograph a narrative of chaos that the facts on the ground did not support. Governors in multiple states are not bit players in the federal system, but are co-sovereigns that are objecting to what's happening. That matters. Federalization is not a slogan for yard signs. It is a living architect of power that keeps any single office from swallowing the rest. And we need to pay attention to that because that's what Trump is doing. He swallowed the Congress. Now he's trying to swallow the courts. The constitutional question is therefore simple. Do we accept that a president may declare a domestic war on a political storyline and construct military power to make the storyline vivid? Or do we insist that that such power be real, narrow, and reviewed in the courts? If the answer is not the latter, then our answer is not the Constitution. Now let's look at the two cities. Portland, the bright line is drawn. Portland is where the line was sharpened in public. Oregon's Attorney General argued the obvious, that protest, even unruly protests within the capacity of local police, is not an insurrection. A federal judge agreed, pausing the president's activization of Oregon National Guard and later halting the attempted deployment of California Guard to sidestep the order. The ruling message was unambiguous by this judge. Urgency is not a license. An executive inconvenience is not an emergency. The response from the president's senior advisor, branding the ruling legal insurrection, was not merely rhetoric excessive. It was an attempt to invert the Constitution, to suggest that judicial rule is a species of rebellion rather than the very mechanism by which the Republic checks a wayward executive. If courts doing their job is insurrection, then lawlessness itself becomes the enemy. We know where that road goes. Let's look at Chicago because it's a fear test. That's all it was. Chicago, meantime, became a test site for fear. Under a banner operation name that reads like a marketing brief, federal agents descended from helicopters onto a residential building after midnight, throwing flashbangs, breaking doors, and zip tying neighbors and residents, including U.S. citizens, amid an elastic set of claims about cartel gang activity. Trump will lie about anything to justify what he's doing. The Department of Homeland Security celebrated arrest numbers while declining to provide the transparent, verifiable, individualized statements that would justify the use of shock and awe tactics in a neighborhood where children slept. Then came the guard over the governor's objection. The president announced the activization of state guard units and then the federalization of out-of-state members for deployment into Illinois and elsewhere. City leaders, civil rights activists, and ordinary residents asked obvious questions. What's the emergency that justifies this? What logistic and legal structure protect residents' rights during quasi-military operations? Where are warrants? Where is the sunlight? The answer trickles out more slowly than the videos, and trust drains away even faster. You cannot secure a city by frightening it. You cannot claim constitutional fidelity by sawing away at the very branch on which domestic legitimacy rests, which is the courts of the United States. The system drift, the election, the speeches, and the machinery of democracy. If you think the noise in the street is the main show, you are sadly mistaken. Let's look at the backstage. Authoritarianism drift operates on 3 levels: spectacle, silence, and structure. Spectacle is the show of force, the helicopters and the late night raids that trains the public to equate visible power with safety. Silence is the message to critics and civil servants, keep your head down. That can be enforced by law or merely by making examples of those who speak. Structure is the administrative reshaping that tilts the playing field. Rules changed, referees replaced, data commandeered, so that by the time the public votes, the forms of participation have been quietly rewritten. That's what gerrymandering is. Consider what has been alleged and report across this service sources that I've provided. Let me show you. Voting rights and the Department of Justice. Once a bulwark against disenfranchisement, the DOJ's voting rights capacity has been thinned while the department pursues state voter data at a level and sensitivity that would give any civilian libertarian pause. If you can force states to surrender driver's license numbers and partial Social Security numbers in the name of integrity, you can construct new barriers with surgical precision. What good is a loud protest on Main Street if the silent cogs of the system are busy disqualifying the vote? And then let's look at compelled speech through government systems. When furloughed employees out of office emails are allegedly replaced with partisan messages sent in their names without consent, the government does not merely insult professional norms, it's a coercive speech that they're using. The First Amendment protects us have to have the right to speak, but also not to speak. And these employees should not ever have their emails used in this way. The Hatch Act protects using government sources for partisan purposes. Crossing both lines at once tells you something about the appetite for control and about the confidence that consequences will be minimal. They are not. Dark money and the capture referee. After Citizens United, which had untraceable money drawn down for elections with independent spending that is independent in name more than spirit, the Federal Election Commission designed to check such distortions often cannot muster a quorum or the necessary votes to act. Meanwhile, the critical threat of a massive anonymous spend hangs over the process like a sword, altering behavior long before a single ad airs. This is what capture feels like. Not a seizure from outside, but a quiet hollowing from inside. Spectacle keeps you watching the sky. Silence keeps you doubting your voice. Structure keeps the game rigged while you are looking elsewhere. Together, they form a choreography of control. History can be a mirror, not a map. We are not living the 1940s. Our military is not Hitler's military, and Donald Trump is not Adolf Hitler. These disclaimers matter because precise thinking matters. But history warns us about human nature, not one-for-one replication of past regimes. A friend sent me a document about from domestic docket, and it narrated a family's history shaped by exile and the lessons of the Holocaust. Lessons distilled into the moral universals we teach children. Never again, never forget. Elie Wiesel, admonition. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. And it is not a line for a poster. It is a demand upon us to look at how we're living. I remember reading Anne Frank's book and what she describes from her attic. She wrote about families dragged from homes at any hour, possessions stolen, lives dismantled without warning. That image lands in our present, not as a direct experience, but as a test when you glimpse even the faintest echo of those patterns. Night raids, children terrified, citizens treated as enemy population. Do you look away because the comparison feeds your fear? Or do you face the echo honestly and ask, what choices today would honor the pledge we made when we say never again will we allow this to happen? We are not the people of the past, but we are not immune from becoming a version of them if we permit fear to do our thinking. The conditions are always different. Human beings are not. Now, I want to rebut a lot of the talking points that have been given out by the administration and various parts of it. Number one, cities are burning, only the military can restore order. Courts examining the Portland record found incidences inexcusable, but well within the capacity of ordinary law enforcement to handle. In other words, no reason was there for militarization. There was no evidence, and it was an inconvenience to the administration, but it was not an emergency. Talking point two, we are protecting federal officers and property. Protection is a duty, but federal protection is not a blank check. It must be conducted by appropriate agencies under lawful processes, with warrants where required, and with the least intrusive tactics necessary. You do not shield a courthouse by turning the surrounding neighborhood into a stage set for fear. They're talking point four. We are only targeting the worst of the worst. Then show your work. Identify the names, the warrants, the individualized probable causes, and the operational necessity for helicopters and for flashbangs in apartment buildings. If a tactic cannot withstand the sunlight, it is not to be used in the darkness. Talking point four, the president is commander-in-chief, not an Oregon judge. The president commands the military. The judge commands the law. That is the point of separation of powers. Calling judge review insurrection is the equivalent of a coup against the Congress, the Constitution of the United States. Talking point five, other presidents federalized the Guard. Yes. President Johnson enforced the rights during the civil rights crisis when Alabama was unwilling to protect their citizens. That is not what is happening here. You cannot cherry pick the form and ignore the moral content. The human cost, we cannot pretend not to see, because there is cost that is staggering to what is happening. Trauma as a public policy. Children who learn to fear uniforms will not easily forget. Parents who watch a door torn from its hinges will not quickly trust again. Communities subjected to shock and awe tactics will carry the memory into every future interaction with the state. Legitimacy depletion. Legitimacy is the state's most precious asset. You spend it when you're careless with power. When communities come to believe that warrants are optional and that force is a first resort, they withdraw consent, the quiet everyday consent that keeps society stable. Precedent drifts. Once you normalize a tactic, you teach future leaders to use it. Some of you may trust the current president. I don't. But if we even allow these kind of tactics to be used, can we trust the next one or the next one? The power invented for your friend today, if you're a Trump supporter, will be available to your adversary tomorrow. Strategic stupidity. Collective punishment is not smart policing. It is an accelerant for protest, a recruiting tool for radicals, and an admission that you cannot separate threat from community. Effective safety work is patient, local, and evidence-driven. It does not feature night vision footage scored with dramatic music. So let's look at what our agenda needs to be. We do not have to drift, as destiny does not exist. The law can be clarified, practice can be constrained, communities can be protected. So I've read a number of different things. These are suggestions I read about, and I hope they'll be helpful to you. Put guardrails on federalization. Congress should codify clear precedents, reporting requirements, automatic sunset clauses, and expedite judicial review whenever federal control guard units are used for domestic policy over state objections. 2, Insurrection Act reform. Any invocation should require a signed public threat assessment by the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence, a notification to congressional leadership, and a rapid judicial check within 72 hours. Posse comitatus enforcement. Create independent oversight with subpoena power and mandatory after-action transparency whenever active duty forces or federal guard support domestic operations. He wants to cover up anything. He wants to write his own script, and Trump does not need to write our script for America. Warrant integrity and sunlight. Require agencies to publish warrants, statistics, and tactical justification for extraordinary measures like helicopter insertions and flashbangs, which are used in non-military operations. And we need to understand that. Those are military operations, they're not non-military. Where mistakes occur, mandate prompt public accountability and remedies for affected residents. Voting rights in infrastructure. Rebuild the DOJ's voting rights unit. Bar compelled wholesale transfer of sensitive voter data without bipartisan commission approval, and narrow purpose statements increase penalties for misuse of electoral data. Hatch Act with teeth. Modernize enforcement to include compelled partisan messaging through official systems, auto replies with automatic inspection general referral during shutdown periods, and swift disciplinary pathways. Campaign sunlight. Passed legislation requiring real-time disclosure of large independent expenditures, strengthen anti-coordination rules and with functional test, and restore FEC functionality with time certain appointment and confirmation rules. City and state compacts for safety. Establish pre-negotiated public protocol among cities, states, and federal agencies for protest management, emphasizing de-acceleration, federal medical access, press protection, and warrant standards. And community first investment. Redirect resources toward violence interruption, youth employment, mental health crisis teams, and trauma-informed services. Safety grows from trust and opportunity, not flyovers. So what can you and I do? Policy can be addressed. Power is not policy. Here are concrete actions that each of us can do. Share know your rights resources. Make warrant requirements, attorney hotlines, and legal observer contacts visible in multiple languages. Teach children what to do if agents arrive. Knowledge reduces panic. Organize peacefully and persistently. The strategy is to bait you into access. Don't take the bait. Be disciplined. Document everything. Support protest marshals and medics. Support the litigators. Support groups like Public Citizen, Democracy Forward, the ACLU, and state attorney generals that are doing the painful court work that holds the line. Fund them, amplify wins, demand updates. Demand transparency from City Hall. Ask for warrants, stats, body cam policies, after action reports, and agreements with federal agencies. Sunlight is the first antidote to fear. Call your legislators. Require hearings on domestic, militarization, and voting rights data demands. Ask where your representatives stand on the Insurrection Act reform or the posse communis enforcement. Invest in local safety. Invest in local safety. Support community organizations that prevent violence without criminalization. The cheapest way to save ourselves is to prevent from taking risk and having people be risk-free from militarization. We have to have the courage to not be absent because of our fear. It is for us to rebut what is happening. And I'm not going to pretend I'm unafraid. I am afraid for immigrants who wonder if a knock at 1 a.m. is a raid or a fire alarm. I'm afraid that families are being divided by status. For teenagers who've learned to recognize the pitch of a helicopter blade. For public citizens who find partisan words stuffed into their inboxes with their names on them. I am afraid for the Constitution when courts are called traitors for doing what is needed. But fear is a signal, not a sentence. It tells us that something we cherish is in danger and that our choices matter. The bright line is not mystical, it is practical. No military policy of American communities, absent a genuine demonstration breakdown in civil order that ordinary law cannot address. We can address these things, not because we're naive about crime or protest, but because we are serious about our self-government. I am drawing the line here for myself, and I'm asking you to do the same at your dinner tables, at the city council, in your state houses, and in Congress. Draw it when you hear the word training grounds. Draw it when you see the video of a child led from a building zip-tied. Draw it when someone tells you a judge is an insurrectionist for asking a president to follow the law. The Mueller's confession ends with a person alone with no one left to speak for him. That is not a poem. It is a map of how silence hardens into fate. We do not have to follow it. We can choose the harder road to speak early, to insist on proof, to demand lawful process, to replace theater with the practical work of safety, and to remember that the point of a republic is not victory over our neighbors, but the shared stewardship of power. So I will keep saying what conscience requires. We do not need martial law. This is America, and America is a place where the law commands the powerful, not the other way around. Trump thinks he is powerful. He is not. We are. We can vote him out of office. We can vote anybody that's a mega Republican out of office, because there are many Republicans, friends of mine, that join us as Democrats to take a stand when this kind of action is occurring. So I choose the Constitution over the strong man, the courtroom over the helicopter, the neighbor over the narrative that's being put out. And I choose to speak before there's no one left to speak for you and me. My name is Dr. Jackalyn Rainosek. I ask you to claim your name and speak against what is happening. Thank you for listening.